Hey, I'm Vlad with Glow Marble, and my friends over at Duomate invited me to their job where they're doing a metallic epoxy floor. They've already poured the entire floor with self-leveling concrete to make everything completely straight. They've done all the touch-ups, and now they're grinding them down so that the epoxy can be as flush and as flat, seamless as possible. They're also touching up the gaps in between the wall and the floor so that the epoxy has nowhere to run down into. And now they're getting ready for the primer coat. While picking a primer, you have to keep in mind the color of the metallics that you're gonna be using. If you're using dark color metallics, you'd want a black primer or a dark gray primer. If you're using light colored metallics like whites, you'd want a white primer underneath that. Before going ahead and applying your epoxy or primer, you gotta make sure that there's absolutely no dust or debris on the floor. That's probably the worst enemy of epoxy. A cheap method of applying primer is using the same epoxy that you're going to be laying onto the floor, only tinted and pigmented a certain color. We got epoxy pigments, which makes it just a complete flat color. We're going to be using black because we're using dark color metallics. And while working with epoxy, it's absolutely necessary to get yourself some spike shoes, because that way you're not going to ruin the surface that you're working with, and it's also going to prevent slipping, because epoxy could sometimes be pretty slippery when you're walking on it with some, let's say, like tennis shoes. The epoxy comes in 2 parts A and 1 part B. Once you start mixing in everything together, you're gonna have to work fairly quickly, especially don't leave it inside of the bucket, because the reaction is gonna make it harden a lot quicker than it would if it was on a completely flat all over the floor. So you can tell this room isn't getting complete full coverage. That's because in the other room we have a little bit of a puddling effect. We made too much epoxy for that room, so we're soaking the brush in epoxy, rubbing it off onto this room, getting it completely dry, and then going back over with that sand roller to scoop up more epoxy. We're ready to put on the epoxy, and we don't need to sand the surface anymore because it's very tacky. You can see that it's leaving my fingerprint over there, and it feels sticky, almost like if you're touching tape. If you wait any longer, you're gonna have to sand that down, vacuum everything, and then that's when you're gonna be applying the epoxy. So this is the next day, we can walk on it, and we're gonna sand it back down so that we can put a sealer over it. We're gonna be putting GU30. It's a polyurethane sealer which has a non-slip resistant additive to add grip to your feet so that when the floor is wet, you won't slip and nobody's gonna get injured. So we're loading up the sander with 60 grit paper, and you could use an orbital sander, but that's probably gonna take you a really long time. It's just a regular buffer with some sandpaper on the bottom. You can rent them out from Home Depot, and they're pretty cheap for like a one-day use. For the last step before applying the sealer, we're gonna go over it with a mop to get that final last touch that the vacuum couldn't clean up. And then we're gonna be ready to apply our sealer. When applying the GU30, a little bit goes a long way. You really don't want to do this too thick because then the epoxy is going to start to yellow up, and that's not going to be a good look. So you've made it to the end of my video, but now I want to ask you for a quick favor. See, the YouTube algorithm gets tricked into showing my video to a lot more people if a lot of people comment on it. So criticize me, praise me, or just ask a question. As long as you leave a comment, I'm gonna appreciate it a lot. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.